What's up, everybody? Matt Gajeski here, back again with the Stokastic channel, talking some college football DFS. It is week 6. We are talking Friday, and we have 4 games to get into. Before we get started, make sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by Prize Picks. And if you've never heard of Prize Picks, they offer daily prop-based contests, no sharks, optimizers, or mass entries. You're creating lineups of player props. You can make lineups with up to 5 of these where you can 10 extra entry fee. And you can do this across sports. You can mix college football with NFL, with MLB, whatever it is you know, you can mix them together. And if you click the link in the video description below, you're going to get 1 free month of Stokastic Plus Platinum and up to a $100 match deposit bonus when you sign up and make your first deposit. Again, you just have to click the link in the video description below to take advantage. All right, 4 games to get into. We'll bring you behind the scenes. This is our player usage data tool on stokastic.com. I did make one change to the team data at the top. We had been doing plays per game. That can get warped occasionally when you have a team that runs, like 90, 100 plays in a game. Looks like they're really fast, but maybe on a per second basis, they're not. So I changed this to seconds per play ranking. So it's going to go 1 through 131 and tell you where the teams rank in terms of pace. So for example, Nebraska is 22nd in pace. Rutgers is 127. Then you've got your pass rates, sacks allowed by the O-line, sacks generated by the D-line, and so forth. Your defensive stats, how many yards they're allowing through the air, how many yards they're allowing through the air per attempt, and the same goes for rushing. So there are the changes we made with the team-by-team stats. And right away, we're going to kick this off with Nebraska taking on Rutgers. 3-point spread in favor of the Cornhuskers. I did bet Nebraska, and the total in the game is 48. From a DFS perspective, it's not a great quarterback slate, so automatically guys like Casey Thompson are going to bubble to the top. Thompson's been pretty efficient. He's averaging just north of 250 yards passing per game. He's been sacked a decent amount, and he's not really scrambling. They don't use him a ton in designed runs, so he has negative rushing yards. He finished with over 100 positive yards last year, so we know that's in his bag. I think against opponents like Rutgers, you're probably going to see him in the positives more often than not, especially when they're favored in games. But he's not rushing to the same degree as he did last year, which is a concern. But overall, he's still a pretty good play. The backfield has been condensed with A.J. Allen injured. He's out for the year. They've given Anthony Grant a massive workload in his absence. 32 carries in their most recent game, 33 overall touches. And no, he's not the most involved in the pass game, just 5 targets in the year. But believe it or not, that leads the team among running backs, that 5-target mark. Behind him, Gabe Ervin is just a change of pace. Anthony Grant is an awesome play here as a favorite against Rutgers, given his usage. He's averaging nearly 119 yards per game on the ground. He's got a massive workload. In the receiving game, Trey Palmer also has an awesome workload. He's averaging 9 targets per game on the year, 96 yards. He hasn't seen fewer than 8 targets in any of the last 3 games. He's just so involved and the clear go-to guy for Casey Thompson. He's a strong play at 6,900. If you're looking for pivots, it's actually pretty condensed in Nebraska right now. Marcus Washington and Alante Brown are the wide receiver 2 and 3. Neither of them are even close to Trey Palmer in terms of efficiency, but if you're just looking for GPP pivots or cheaper options to double stack, Marcus Washington would be slightly preferred to Alante, but they're both involved. And then honestly, Travis Volkolek, since he returned from injury, he's their tight end. His route share jumped above 75% last week. He's really involved when he's not hurt, immediately popped for 4 targets. As far as pure value goes, he's honestly right there in play. So I don't hate any of these top 4. Nebraska's actually a pretty solid team to target overall in this spot. Rutgers, they're a lot more difficult to decipher. They're dealing with quarterback issues. Gavin Wimsatt's banged up. They actually returned Noah Vidral last week, but he didn't throw a pass. So you're not seeing him pop up in our usage tool. And you need to throw a pass to qualify. But they did run him 4 times. So it appears he's getting healthier. He's the stone minimum for quarterbacks, 4,500. If Vidral gets full work, he's going to be a value play. You're just not going to know whether that's going to occur. So I think you could play Vidral in GPPs. He's healthy enough to run, but apparently not healthy enough to throw. And we'll see with him. It's hard to say. In the backfield, it's a full 3-way committee with Kyle Monangai, Samuel Brown, Al-Shadi Salam, even Johnny Langham, who's a former quarterback, now a tight end. DraftKings lists all tight ends as receivers. he's been involved in the ground. He's 22 carries, and he's really involved as a pass catcher too. We'll talk about him there in a second, but he renders this even more of a committee. And then plus Aaron Young's been warming up for some games now. If he plays, it's even muddier. So not targeting any runners for Rutgers, unless you consider Langen a runner. I do think he's the best pass catcher to target and overall player to target on Rutgers. He's averaging 4.4 targets per game. Overall, he's averaging 9 touches, which is pretty good considering a decent amount of these come in the run game. Nobody on Rutgers has been efficient in terms of receiving. But for those of you that are just looking for a run back on the Rutgers side, if you're stacking Nebraska or you just want a one-off play, Langen, I think, is the best. Crookshank got ejected in their last game. He should be fine here. I haven't seen any reason otherwise. He's actually their leading receiver, 164 yards, but that's just a 33-yard per game average. Crookshank, I'd rather play Langen, to be honest. And then they rotate so many receivers outside of this. Sean Ryan, Shameen Jones, Joshua Youngblood. Even Chris Long has ascended into like a 50 to 60% route share type play on a week-to-week basis. He's seen 3 targets in each of the last 2 games. I'd rather just play Langen and get the secure work than play any of these dart throws. Next game, Memphis and Houston. We see Memphis is a 3-point favorite here, 57.5 total. This is a tough game to evaluate. Houston struggled a lot this year, but from a DFS perspective, I think we do want to get to both teams here. The total is 57.5 again, which is pretty decent in the context of this slate. We don't really have a 65-point total to get to, so these two teams have good totals. Clayton Tune, 191 rushing yards. That's solid. He's averaging about 240 yards through the air on 32 attempts. Volume is pretty good for Tune. I think he's one of the better quarterback plays on the slate overall, despite the struggles he may have had in terms of real-life football. And he's easy to stack. Nathaniel Dell is an alpha. He's averaging 8.6 targets per game, just over 90 receiving yards with spike week potential. His target share is at 29.5%. It's one of the better marks on the slate. Love Nathaniel Dell. Matthew Golden's the wide receiver too in terms of routes, but he's been far less consistent. Just 35.5 yards per game for him, 4 targets per game. Doesn't have as much spike potential, hasn't seen more than 5 targets in any of the last 4. And then we get to the wide receiver 3. Joseph Manjack is hurt. So we saw Keyshawn Carter and Samuel Brown rotate this position last week. There isn't really clarity between them. It's kind of zigzag back and forth. If I was targeting one of them, it's probably Samuel Brown at 3,300 at this point, but I don't feel great about it. And you look at his routes, 60%, Keyshawn Carter, 42%. Honestly, where I might go is tight end Christian Trahan. He'd seen a diminished role through the first 3-4 games of the year, but due to Manjack's injury, popped back up to a 74% route share last week. 5 targets. For those of you below 4K, I think Christian Trahan has a more consistent role than either receiver. In the run game, Tazon Henry, gone for the year, unfortunately. But one thing that does is somewhat consolidate backfield opportunities, largely towards Brandon Campbell. 19 carries in their last game, 2 targets in the past game, 21 overall touches. That's better than any mark he'd seen in the previous 3 games. If anything, it just helps boost that workload a little bit here, even if Houston hasn't been a great running team. I'll be playing some Brandon Campbell based on the workload. Stacey Sneed has shown nothing more than change of pace volume this year. I would expect this to be a 70-30, maybe even 80-20 split Campbell's way. Memphis. Hennigan is really interesting here too. He quietly has a pretty good rushing floor, 147 yards for Hennigan. That's a bit shocking, but volume is good for him. Over 250 passing yards on 33.5 attempts. And generally targeting Hennigan hasn't been really attractive this year, but Memphis has the highest implied team total on the slate. Again, it's just north of 30 points, but where's the other upside coming from? We don't have any elite team totals or like super air raid offenses. And the one we do have is Colorado State. There's problems there. So all that to say, Hennigan actually comes up as a slightly better play than maybe you would think at first glance. In the backfield, this is a little bit of a tougher situation to target. It is a 3-way timeshare. Jevion Ducker's been the most efficient, but he's seen less work than Brandon Thomas pretty clearly too. 11.4 touches per game for Thomas, 7.8 for Ducker, even 8.6 for Asa Martin. Jevion Ducker hasn't seen as many touches as Asa Martin on a per game basis. But overall, Ducker is the cheapest. He's the stone minimum. He's just at a different price point than the other two. So I think for those of you targeting a Memphis back, Ducker gives you the most upside. And then among receivers, it's pretty clearly a top 4 for this team. You've got Javon Ivory, Eddie Lewis, and Gabriel Rogers. The snaps and routes and volumes are pretty consistent between them. Ivory, 6.2 targets per game. Lewis, 5 targets per game. Rogers, 4.2 targets per game. But Rogers actually leads the team in receiving. So I think I'd rather pay down for him rather than pay up for 6K Ivory or 5.4K Lewis. Rogers seems to make the most sense here. But tight end Caden Prescorn has actually been really involved too. He has 178 yards, which is right on par with these other receivers. He's just 1 yard behind Javon Ivory. So you can see this is tight with these guys. And Prescorn is the cheapest of the 4, so I have no issue getting to him either. I'll be playing a decent amount of this Memphis team all the way from Hennigan through the running backs down to these receivers. And again, Hennigan, slightly better rushing floor than maybe you would even see at first glance here. Colorado State, Nevada, lowest total on the board, 44 points, 3.5 point spread in favor of Nevada. Colorado State runs the air raid, passing over 50% of the time. They lost Clay Millen to an injury, so they're now looking towards freshman Braden Fowler Nicolosi, who has no sample. Completed 40% of his passes last week, just 4 rushing yards. I'd rather play Vidral if he's active. I'd basically rather play every other signal color on the slate. But the one thing you can say is he's unknown. So if he ends up outperforming expectation, he'll never be this cheap again. I'm more likely to bet on him getting cheaper than 5,800 later in the year. Backfield, 3-way timeshare. David Bailey left the program, so now you're just going to see Ajon Vivens, Avery Morrill, and Jalen Thomas. Vivens is the best guy to get to if you're playing any of them. He averages 12.7 touches per game, but just 35.5 rushing yards. Is pretty brutal out there in terms of efficiency for these backs. I'd rather play Ducker. In the receiving game, they also had Melquan Stovall leave the program. That consolidates opportunity for the top 3 guys, Torrey Horton, Ty McCullough. They were already operating as top 2 guys. And then Justice Ross Simmons, he's now assumed that wide receiver 3 role, 5 targets in their last game, 100% of the routes. No questions there. They run 4 wide a fair amount. So now with Justice Ross Simmons in an elevated role, we saw Lewis Brown pop up for a 60% route share, 2 targets for Lewis Brown. Stone minimum, but Justice Ross Simmons is as well. So 1 for 1, I'd rather play JRS. And then among the expensive guys, Torrey Horton's pretty clearly the leader. He's the only player averaging more than 35 receiving yards per game, and he's at 106.8. Horton has 427 yards. The next leading receiver is Ty McCullough at 119. Horton's very clearly the receiver to target among the expensive guys. Nevada. They went back to Nate Cox. He was injured earlier in the year, and then he's now come back. Nate Cox, I guess this team is favored for one of the rare times all year. He has 100 rushing yards, which is good considering he missed 2 games. Just 20.8 attempts, 130 passing yards per game. He's just not super involved as a passer. So at 6K, there's going to be other players that have better ceiling floor combos than Cox. But for tournaments, we can't say he's playing a bad defense against a bad defense. And this is one of the rare times they'll be favored. So upside is there. For stacking him, we really see 3 main options. Jamal Bell, 6.8 targets per game. BJ Castile, 4 targets per game. Devellon Campbell, who's come into a larger role. He was playing in place of Tyrese Mack. Devellon Campbell's actually averaging 6.3 targets per game in the last 3 since that injury occurred. And he's 3,200. So I prefer to get down to him than rather pay 5K plus for Castile and Bell, just because you're dealing with low upside situation anyway. So Campbell will be the guy I get to. Jacob Monroe's the tight end. He's the stone minimum. Campbell's just more involved than him for $200 more. The backfield, Toa Tau and Devontae Lee form a sort of 70-30, 60-40 committee. But recently that's kind of shifted towards more of a timeshare. Last game, Tau 10 touches, Devontae Lee 5. It's gotten closer and closer, but I think if you're betting on one, Tau has shown more upside. On the year, Tau averages 20.2 touches per game, whereas Devontae Lee's at 10.4. Tau has actually been pretty efficient too. I have no issue playing him. Lee would be more of your GPP contrarian option. Last game, UNLV takes on San Jose State. 7-point spread in favor of San Jose State. 52.5 total is pretty good here. UNLV has been in a couple close games recently after playing really well to start the year. Dung Brumfeld is expensive, but he's mobile, 142 rushing yards on the year. Averages 243.5 as a passer. He's solid. Volume's not spectacular, but overall, Brumfield's gotten the job done. I think he's fine. Aiden Robbins, he is an elite bell cow back in terms of G5. He's averaging 23 touches per game. His touch counts over the last 3 games, 27, 29, and 31. Holy smokes, even if he's wildly inefficient, this volume is way too good to pass up here. Over 100 rushing yards per game on the year. They are touchdown underdogs, but he's hyper involved in the pass game as well. He averages 3 targets over the last 4 there. Love Robbins. In the receiving game, dealing with injuries to Kyle Williams and Jeffrey Weimer. Weimer was left off the depth chart, so I would be surprised if he plays. Williams was called a game time decision by the coaching staff, and he's a key player for this team. I think he plays here, but I would be a little weary of potential less than 100% situation. Anyway, he's a top 2 receiver. Both him and Ricky White average 7.3 targets per game over their last 3 games. White averages 7.4 on the year, 72 yards. Kyle Williams is at 6.5 targets per game. They're very close. I prefer White if you can find the extra 300, but if you need to play Williams, they're both decent plays here. For what it's worth, I would rather play like Palmer or Dell if you can find the salary, but if you can't, I'll play some UNLV. The wide receiver 3 is going to be Seneca McKee. 7 targets in their last game, full route share. He's completely fine. They played McKee over Nick Williams, despite listing Nick Williams as the starter. Don't be confused there. It's McKee. And even you go down, Calvin Soders played more than Nick Williams. And Soders had 4 targets. If for whatever reason Williams and Weimer missed the game, I would expect the 3 wide receiver configuration to be Ricky White 1, Seneca McKee 2, Calvin Soders 3, and Nick Williams the sparsely used 4. And lastly, they do use tight end Shelton Zion a fair amount. He has 10 targets on the year. At this cheap price, I would rather just play McKee over him. Last team, San Jose State. Second highest implied team total. Chevon Cordero, good mobility. Hasn't even shown as much upside as he has in previous years there when he played at Hawaii. And as a passer, he runs an air raid scheme at San Jose. 34 attempts per game, 270 yards through the air. Cordero is a rock-solid option at 7K. In the backfield, we're seeing this former committee split, and now it's becoming more of a feature back role for Kyrie Robinson. 5,500 for him. He's averaging 15.3 touches per game, but in their most recent contest, 21 touches for Robinson. The efficiency is not really there. The weakness of this unit is their offensive line, but at a cheap price, you can look at bankable work with Kyrie Robinson. In the receiving game, Elijah Cooks has been a monster. 94 yards per game, 7.5 targets on the year. He's actually cheaper than Justin Lockhart, despite having a significantly better role. Again, 7.5 targets for Cooks. Lockhart's at 6 targets per game. You can play Lockhart in GPPs as leverage, but Cooks just projects straight up better than him. The wide receiver 3 is going to be Charles Ross most of the time. There is a little bit of volatility with this situation once you get to the ancillary pieces. For reference, Ross had a 70% route share last week, and they still used some players, like Skylar Loving-Black's a tight end, Dominic Mazzotti. These guys play a fair amount too. So it's Charles Ross is not going to be at like 100% of the routes like Cooks and Lockhart, but you still have upside for around 70% with him. And then we just mentioned some tight ends. They use a decent amount of 12 personnel. Nothing crazy, but one thing we'll mention with tight ends, they had been using a lot of Sam Olsen. For reference, in week 2, 96% routes. In week 4, 91%, 92%. They had a bye in week 3. But then in their most recent game, 13% for Sam Olsen. Dominic Mazzotti had been injured. He comes back, 86% of the routes for Mazzotti. This could be a changing of the guard. Don't feel super confident in it. So honestly, among these cheaper plays, I would rather get to one of the other values or just find the salary to get Ross or Cooks or one of these players. But that'll do it for us today with the Friday 4-game college football week 6 DFS slate. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think of the picks. What do you think of the breakdown? I'll make sure to get back to you. If you'd like to reach out, I'm on Twitter at Matt_Gajeski. Otherwise, we'll be back a little later on for the full main slate breakdown, and we will catch you then. Good luck, guys.